And yet, here's something that I think we need to think about. Whenever we consider these possibilities, we need to constantly be mindful of the fact that we love to scare the hell out of ourselves.
Warning, this is not entertainment.
Welcome to the Suck. We're a month into the shutdown here in the United States and most of the Western world, most of the developed world for that matter. It's April 17th as I'm recording this. I think America shut down the weekend of March 14th, and the world was turned on its head. It's kind of funny thinking back when I published the first podcast of the year back in January. It was just a quick hit right after Soleimani's assassination. I remember making a comment about hoping that didn't set the tone for the rest of the year. And boy, could I have made a prediction. I don't think I could have predicted anything like this. I'm glad I didn't try to predict what would happen throughout the rest of this year, because this one just caught everybody off guard. 100 years almost on the dot. I mean, we passed it by a couple. So like 102, 103 years since the last true pandemic, the Spanish flu. And then all of a sudden, behold a pale horse. It's funny how the sentiment's changed, right? I mean, when the first rumblings of the coronavirus started, and I'm not talking about the reporters and the doctors who were kind of the whistleblowers in China, because a lot of that didn't really make it to the mainstream Western media until after the fact. But when we really started hearing about it in the West, I think it was, mid to late February, we started to hear about rumors of a potential epidemic at that point. I think most of us just brushed it off. I know most of my network of friends and acquaintances did, just looking at memes on social media and comments, things like that. People didn't really seem to take it seriously. And then all of a sudden, when we just shut the country down, or I think it was when Disney announced they were shutting their parks, and then the NBA, like halfway through games, decided that they were shutting down that night. That's when the sentiment started to change and people started to say, hold up a minute, what's going on? And I'll admit, myself, I was kind of taken aback thinking that this might be an extreme overreaction. But I wasn't sure, so I didn't comment on it. And that's partially why you haven't heard from me yet. I don't know if you're sitting around waiting for a podcast from me on the subject of coronavirus. If you are, sorry to disappoint you to this point. But the reason why I didn't want to jump behind the microphone and put a podcast out, I mean, God knows I've had the time to do it. I've been quarantined at home just like everybody else. The reason why is because I didn't really feel like I had anything of value to add, because we've been living in a world of hyper speculation. I mean, there have been the doom and gloom artists. There have been the people who are the ever-present optimists who are saying this will just blow over and things will go back to normal in no time. V-shaped recovery in the stock market. Everybody who's lost their job will get right back to work in the summer, and America's going to pick up where it left off. So, I mean, you have really strong opinions on both sides, but at the end of the day, I think if we're truly honest with ourselves, the reality is that nobody has a clue of how this is going to play out. I've been doing a little bit of research on the history of the Spanish flu, and the Spanish flu tapered off in the summer, and then it came back with a vengeance in the fall. Now, the coronavirus, it's a corona, it's not an influenza, so it's a bit different, and it's a respiratory disease. I don't know if it's going to have that same capability. I mean, nobody knows right now, right? That's the thing. We're playing with a mysterious disease here, but assuming that capability exists and that trajectory becomes a real one, then we haven't even scratched the tip of the iceberg. Because if we open things back up and then have to close them again, imagine what that'll do to sentiment and what that'll do to the long-term labor force, because there's nothing that the economy hates more than uncertainty. So I think we're seeing a bit of a rally of optimism right now, because there's talk about Gilead and Johnson & Johnson working on potential vaccines that might be able to fight this thing off, then maybe they'll be ready by the fall. But unless everything goes perfect and those things happen, I think we're in for a lot more pain ahead. So I don't want to sound too doom and gloom here, because like I said, I don't know any better than anybody else how this is going to play out. Maybe this will be over by June, and by this time next year it'll be ancient history. I really, really don't know. But I think that when you build a civilization on the back of debt, every disaster becomes an economic disaster. Like this really had no business being an economic disaster. If this had happened 10, 20 years ago, it probably wouldn't have been, largely because globalization hadn't taken hold to the effect that it has now. I mean, China made up a very small portion of the overall market share, and now they're a juggernaut on par with the United States. That's what, has shaken the world markets and really brought us to the brink of another Great Depression, to be frank. 22 million people in America have lost their jobs in the last 3 weeks. That's insane. Literally insane. Like we've seen nothing like it. And conservative estimates are saying that we'll be at 15 to 20% unemployment by the end of May. So we're truly in uncharted territory. And the reason why I didn't want to get behind the microphone and record a podcast about it was because I don't think I could have said anything different than basically what I just said in that 2-minute synopsis, which is probably the same thing you've heard from 50 other outlets over the last several weeks. So rather than being just another voice in that Chicken Little environment of the sky is falling, I just figured I would keep my mouth shut and just wait and see how things play out before I weighed an assessment on it. So I still don't have a strong opinion on how things are going to unfold in terms of the disease, but I do have some concerns, I'll say, and some thoughts that are starting to concern me more and more about the aftermath of this. I've talked to a few of you out there about this, directly over the phone or over email, and I've talked to some friends about this, and I think that the risk that is at the forefront of all of this, that is, the 400-pound gorilla in the room, is what happens afterwards. It was Rahm Emanuel, who worked in the White House under President Obama. He worked under Clinton as well, but really made a name for himself under Obama. He said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." And I assure you, this is not a partisan thing, Democrat or Republican, but I assure you, on both sides of the aisle, there are many people in Washington right now who are trying to figure out how to use this crisis to their advantage. And to their advantage when it comes to politics, I always mean accumulating more power for themselves. I think you're already starting to see some of that. A lot of the government bailout money. I mean, the Fed has just been helicopter money on steroids, literally buying everything they can physically purchase. A lot of that's going to big corporations, mega corporations, what we would have called too big to fail in the 2008-2009 recession. But, they're cranking it up 20 notches. All of that is going to have repercussions down the road. I don't know what that's going to look like yet, but it puts us in a place where we could very easily start flirting with something that looks a lot like fascism. And again, maybe that sounds hyperbolic. Maybe you've heard that from other people in the last several weeks. I don't know. Again, partially why I've been hesitant to record, because I don't want to sound hysterical. And I know I do have a tendency to sometimes be expressive and hyperbolic. So I'm going to try to rein it in and be as even-keeled when I say this. But I think that if there were ever a recipe for Caesar, a recipe for the form of government and the liberties that we've enjoyed to ever be upset, to ever turn that wagon on its head, I think this is the environment for it. I'm not saying it's going to happen tomorrow. I'm not saying Donald Trump is going to stand up behind a podium at the next State of the Union and cancel all of the elections in the future and say that he's president for life. I'm not saying anything like that. I'm just saying that bit by bit, we've been chipping away at our liberties for decades, and it's accelerated more and more over the last, probably 20, 30 years. A big chunk was stripped away after 9/11 with the Patriot Act. I think you should expect and really be vigilant in watching for something similar like that in the aftermath of this, something on par with the Patriot Act, and maybe even more so. I mean, this has really been like an economic collapse on steroids, so we're doing everything bigger this time around. Who knows? Maybe we'll do that bigger too. But, I mean, there's already rumors about requiring apps on people's phones or even microchips or tests that are mandatory to check for body temperature. We're talking about body scanners and infrared scanners. It's basically going to be like the TSA every time you want to go to a grocery store or a shopping mall. You get the airport experience. Imagine what that would be like. Imagine what type of surveillance, we would have to live under. But, just like before the Patriot Act, you couldn't, comprehend a world, where the TSA looked like it does now, and where, unreasonable search and seizure and wiretapping were just commonplace, and, drone strikes on American citizens were authorized by the United States president. I mean, as much as you couldn't imagine those things prior to 9/11, I think what we're living through right now, people 3-4 months ago wouldn't have been able to imagine the world that we might be living in on the other side of this. And I think a big part of that is going to be a surveillance state type world. Again, not to be fear-mongering here, but just to be forward-thinking, and to cause you to be a little bit shrewd and diligent as you look for signs and cues in the media and from your politicians, because this isn't just an American thing. I know we have a lot of listeners in the UK and Australia and other countries, and I think this stands true across developed nations in general, that I think governments are going to use this as an opportunity to consolidate power. I mean, we've already seen it in countries like Hungary, where their leader has really basically just used this as an opportunity to make himself an authoritarian leader. And it's not the only place. That's going to happen more and more in small countries. I'm hearing rumors about things like that happening in Latin America and smaller countries. So just be vigilant, because a surveillance state has already only been arm's length away from us for a while now. And I think on the other side of this, people will be more receptive to the idea of putting safety before liberty. And if you choose security over liberty, it's going to bite you in the ass at some point. But people aren't going to see it that way, especially, on the other side of a crisis like this, when they realize, okay, my economic livelihood, was a hair's breadth away from being taken away from me. I've been quarantined in my house for months. I don't want to be subjected to that again. Therefore, take my liberties. I'll do whatever you tell me to do, whether that means, carrying papers around saying that I'm coronavirus free, or putting myself through a, heat scanner, or, you name it, RFID sensors. All of those things, I think, have been floated around, maybe carelessly, for a couple of decades. I mean, you started hearing about those things in the early 2000s for the most part, the technocratic future. But I think people have been waiting for an excuse to pull out some of those things. And I think this is a perfect test case to really give those things, to give them a wheel, to give them a whirl, give them a trial run in the real world. So don't be surprised, is all I'm saying, if those things grow more and more, and that the rallying cry for those things that will strip away your independence and your liberty grow. I mean, we've taken for granted that in America, you can just get in your truck or get in your car and you can drive across a dozen states from coast to coast. Nobody's going to stop you. Nobody's going to ask questions. I mean, hell, for the most part, you can wander into the Canadian territory, across the Canadian border, hassle-free. I mean, those days could be gone. They could already be over, and we might not even realize it yet. I mean, I'm hearing about people who, for my corporation, who work in Canada, who, are already being told when this ends, like, they're going to have a very, very difficult time getting into Canada to do business. I mean, Canada, the United States and Canada have had a very easy travel policy for my entire life, and, for decades and decades before that. So it's just an example of how the world can change so quickly in the blink of an eye. Open borders, I think, you look at immigration coming through the Middle East, coming through Turkey, and Turkey's basically, letting people pass right through their borders into Europe because they don't want to deal with it. That could get nasty really quickly. So, I mean, look at the immigration, policy and the disaster that we've seen in Europe over the last couple of years already. Like, people coming from Libya, people coming from all over North Africa and the Middle East, trying to get into Europe. Well, amplify that, several fold now because of this crisis. So it's a recipe for an explosive disaster. And the virus itself is a disaster, but I think that what could potentially come after this could be so much worse. I mean, you've heard people in the media for the last several weeks, you've heard Trump say it himself, the cure cannot be worse than the disease. And he's right. To an extent, the cure cannot be worse than the disease. You can't cripple the whole economy and cause people to lose, their livelihood. And I'm not a diehard capitalist. I'm not saying like we need to sacrifice our grandparents at the altar of capitalism. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying at what point do you weigh the pros and the cons of keeping the country shut down? Because we're looking at the death count trajectory here, and I think we did take the right action. I think that if we didn't shut down the country and impose this social distancing and the stay-at-home measures, I think you would have seen several million people die. Probably, just in America and Britain alone. And then you throw in Italy and Spain. Yeah, easily several million between those 4 countries. I mean, China as well. I think we did the right thing by not, just letting those people die, for the sake of keeping the world running. However, at this point, I think when you're talking about unemployment levels of 30, 40% as a worst case scenario, and a feasible worst case scenario, at that point you have to start thinking it's time to figuring out a way to get things open, even if it's not completely normal, because the social unrest, the economic despair, the depression, the self-inflicted abuse, and domestic abuse and child abuse, alcoholism, all those things are going to start ticking up. You watch it. You look at the numbers a year from now of all of those statistics, all those metrics that I just mentioned. I guarantee you pretty much all of them will be higher. Some like murder will probably go down because people have been restrained from one another, which, that's a good thing. CO2 levels, climate change and things like that, whether you believe it's man-made or not, this is good for the earth. There's no bones about that. And that's an interesting thing, we could talk about in another podcast on its own maybe sometime. It's just how Mother Nature will always find a way to heal herself, and, maybe sending a virus to get rid of us is a way of curing herself. It's interesting how those things work and how they're cyclical, but it's undeniable that the smog levels have been reduced, and this is going to be a net positive for the earth in general. I was looking at pictures of Yosemite Park the other day. Bears that normally stay away from people have really come down and kind of just reclaimed a main part of the Yosemite Valley. It's kind of beautiful to see, even if it is going to be short-lived. And it's just a reminder that Mother Nature does not give a shit about you and me, and she will find a way to, take care of herself. So there are bright spots in this doom and gloom, but I think a loss of our liberty is a very clear and present danger on the other side of this. So that's something I feel confident talking about behind the microphone right now. And you're not hearing a ton of that in the mainstream media, and you probably won't. You'll hear it in some YouTube channels and commentators, but just be vigilant and diligent in watching for it. Watch when they start proposing legislation about what it's going to look like when they open the economy again, because if it involves heat scanners and 24-hour surveillance and random testing, once you give those liberties up, you do not get them back. I promise you. It's like in New York, where I grew up, we have the thruway system. In most states around the United States, we have the interstate thruway, which is it's a toll road, it's a paid road. When those roads were built, it was always built on the premise that they would be a toll road until the cost of construction was paid for, and then they would become free, and they would remove all of those toll stations. Well, as you can guess, that never happened. We're still paying tolls on all of those roads across the country, even though they've been paid off for years. Well, why? Because once the government realizes they can do something, they do it, and they don't relinquish it. It just becomes a cash cow. Now, I'm not talking about this being a cash cow, but it will become a power grab, and it will become a control mechanism that they will not easily relinquish. Case in point, the Patriot Act. So I don't know what that's going to look like, but I do think that we're flirting dangerously close with a fascist surveillance state. I don't want to talk politics in this. Most of you know my opinions on Donald Trump. I'm not a fan. I also don't think he's the worst thing in the history of the world. I kind of come down somewhere in the middle, but still not being a fan or somebody who would vote for Trump. But I wouldn't have voted for Hillary either. And I don't judge you or hate you or think you're an idiot if you did vote for Trump. My qualms were always with the conservative Christians who said that he was a godsend or he was like a Cyrus figure. To me, that's laughable and ridiculous. I guess a sin to even think something like that. I think Donald Trump he's a symptom. He's a symptom of a larger ill, a larger sickness that's been coursing through the veins of this country. And I get it. A part of me, as much as I despised the man on a personal level, a part of me was happy that he won the election because it was the ultimate F you to the system. It was just the ultimate stick the finger to the man. And the little guy deserved it. I mean, you and me, we've been, taken advantage of by white-collar corporate elites for decades in this country. And I think the bailouts in 2008 and 2009 were kind of like the final nail in the coffin to the system. And, Obama ran on hope and change, and, you didn't really see any change. Corporate America just got wealthier and wealthier while the average man struggled. So I get it. I totally get why a Donald Trump would come to power this time in America. But you have to be honest with yourself. I mean, the guy has all the makings of a demagogue, and I don't think he will be that. I don't think that at all. But I think that he sets a standard that could easily be replicated and followed in the years and decades ahead. When things become your norm, you just begin to accept them. That's just human nature. You become desensitized to things. Like, you remember how outrageous it was seeing Trump on those debate stages with other Republicans in the early days of the Republican primaries back in 2015? I mean, we were all outraged, and I think that was kind of what made him so popular, was that people were just so drawn in at the entertainment value. Like, what crazy thing is this guy going to say next? Now we're all pretty much numb to that. Like, people just are desensitized to it. I mean, unless you're CNN, which sounds like a nagging ex-girlfriend all the time, just always railing on how much they hate Trump, even skewing the news to, make him just sound terrible all the time, even for things that he doesn't do. I mean, unless you're on that level of cynicism, most of us are desensitized to it. And that concerns me, the fact that it's just becoming normal. Because if it's becoming normal, what comes next? Like, how do you top that? Because somebody will try. Somebody is going to try to run on that model. And we have really laid the groundwork for a demagogue to really turn the whole system on its head. America has enjoyed liberty, unlike most countries around the world, for the last 2.5 millennia. And I know my European friends will kind of laugh when I say that. Like, you Americans always think that you're so free. You're the freest people, and, you pride yourself on it. I'm not saying that other countries don't have freedom. But America is unique in the sense that we were built on a constitution that the world had not seen anything along those lines of since, the Roman Republic. I mean, we really set a standard in this country of what the world could be. And you've seen that kind of chip away bit by bit. And I'll be the first to admit other countries have kind of come along and maybe even done it better since us. But America was the first. We were the one who really sparked that flame that became a forest fire. The French Revolution happened shortly after, and that turned into a disaster. But other countries finally gained their independence and their liberty, but that started here. I mean, America was the example. And my fear is that this country is losing what made it unique and beautiful bit by bit. There are many, many reasons for that. Loss of national identity being one of them, economic despair being another, the growth of corporate elitism. I mean, it goes on and on. The haves versus the have-nots, to sum it up. But the danger is that America is flirting with becoming something that is unrecognizable, something that would be unrecognizable to the greatest generations that came before us, the generations that built this nation on their own blood, sweat, and tears. And that concerns me. It makes me sad more than anything. I mean, it doesn't really make me fearful. It makes me sad because I don't know what the way out is for this. I mean, like I said, Donald Trump is more of a symptom than a disease himself. I think he's a symptom of a disease that's been in this country for a long time, and maybe a necessary one. Again, I'm not a fan of Trump, but please don't misconstrue this to think that I don't think that this is necessary for this time. I think America needed something like this. I mean, Trump's not the vessel I would have chosen, but beggars can't be choosers. I've been hoping for decades. I mean, I'm not that old, but I would say I've been hoping for maybe a decade and a half for, a politician to come along who would really just turn the establishment on its head. And lo and behold, this reality TV star comes along and does it. And I think because he was a reality TV star projecting that persona and imagery for so long, that's why he won. I mean, like it or not, America has kind of become an entertainment-based nation. Like, we are consumed with it in every facet of our life. So if you play to that medium, it propels you into the spotlight. And that's what Donald Trump did. He leveraged the entertainment value that he brings. I think that's a recipe for disaster. And I'm not going to keep banging on this, but I just want to say that if you aren't diligent in watching for it, it will sweep you off your feet and you will lose your liberties before you can bat an eyelash. And then you'll wonder where they went. Just be prepared. And on that same vein of preparedness, I think that we're in kind of a lull period here. I don't want to make predictions of how the virus is going to play out over the next couple of months, but let's just assume that it comes back, that it follows the Spanish flu trajectory and it comes back at some point. I mean, there's people saying that, they had it before and then they were, healthy again and then they tested positive again later. So maybe you don't even build up immunity, which would be a whole nother disaster. Let's just assume it comes back at some point, whether it's later this summer or next year, whatever. This is kind of the in-between time now, because I think there's some optimism that's going to rally us into some level of normalcy, at least for the next few weeks, as we start to open places back up. And unless you're in like New York City or New Jersey, I think you should use this time of, freedom and mobility to replenish your supplies. If you have guns, which I hope you do already, get some more ammo. If you don't have a classic self-defense weapon or even an assault-type weapon, you should get one just to have it on hand in case, the zombie apocalypse equivalent kicks in. If social unrest really hits home and there is 20-30% unemployment in this country, people will be breaking into other people's houses. Desperate people do desperate things. So be prepared for that. Use this time to get prepared. I mean, we're getting a reprieve kind of in the middle of this, so be thankful for it and use it. Don't squander it. Don't go stock up on toilet paper or junk food. Get the food, get the things that you need to survive, but I think those supply chains will be intact, at least for the foreseeable future. Have a little bit of extra fuel that you can keep in your garage in case you need to, load up your vehicle and the gas stations are closed for a period of time. Have some cash on hand. I can't stress that enough. I don't think the dollar is going to collapse anytime soon. I'd say have at least a few $100 just in case the ATMs and the banks close down. Again, this isn't fear mongering. This is just basic preparedness. I'm not saying go put your entire stock portfolio into gold and silver coins. I'm not saying to do that. Have a portion of your portfolio into safe, securities, maybe even, gold and silver, but a small, realistic portion, because that serves as a counterbalance to, fear and market collapses. But don't go crazy with that. I think you'd be much better served putting money and energy into just overall preparedness. If you can grow a garden at home and grow your own food, do it. And I've always been an advocate of this. There's nothing like the satisfaction that comes with growing your own food. To quote Thomas Jefferson, like I often do, the chosen people of God, if he ever had a chosen people, are those who labor in the earth. There's something sacred about growing your own food and sustaining yourself and your family with your own hands. Do that. We're all locked down at home. This is the perfect time to experiment with growing a garden, even if it's small scale. I'm doing that right now. Got my seeds planted and they're growing nicely in my house. Just be ready. Be ready for things to take another downward turn. Hopefully I'm wrong. Hopefully it doesn't happen, but I don't think we're out of the woods, and I don't think we're even coming out of the woods yet. I think we're going to be going into a darker period. And even if the virus is somewhat under control over the next couple of months, I think that we're going into a darker period economically, at least for the remainder of this year, and that could translate into some serious changes to the way government operates and the way we exercise our liberties. So be ready for that. If you're outside of an urban area, more power to you. If you live in a dense urban area, just have an escape route just in case. If it looks like things are going to get sketchy, don't find yourself trapped in a major population center. I was thinking of Mark Twain earlier. He had also the famous quote, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. I'm pretty sure that was Twain. I think look to history as your benchmark. You guys know how much I love history. It's my favorite thing to study in my own leisure time. I like history because I like to look for it to guidance. I like to look to it. I like to look to history for guidance for the future. I think that history truly does rhyme in the sense that human nature doesn't change. So when disasters happen, and they do happen, they've always happened. If you believe in the Bible and the scriptures, the Bible says we've always had these things with us, and we always will have them with us. There's nothing new under the sun. if that's the case, then you should also expect that human nature does not change either, and that our responses to these disasters will also be the same. So be ready for that. Be ready for how people will respond to crises like this. Case in point, the Great Depression, early 1930s, when the market crashed in the end of the 20s and dragged on to the early 30s, people weren't sure how America was going to get back on its feet, how Europe was going to get back on its feet. We had Roosevelt's New Deal, but even then, it wasn't a sure thing. What really brought us out of the Great Depression, pop quiz for the day, it was World War II. War follows depression. It's no secret. The military-industrial complex will be an injection of liquidity and an injection of resources, because you go to war, you rally national sentiment, and you can consume the natural resources of other nations through conquest. So I think large part of World War II was predicated on the Great Depression happening. I don't think World War II would have unfolded the same way it did if there hadn't been a depression at the end of the 20s into the early 30s. Just a theory of mine. It's not a theory I came up with, but I think it's a well-founded theory, and it's something that I kind of look to throughout history and kind of see a pattern for. So if this does truly blow up into something worse than 2009 and looks more akin to 1929, then I think you need to be prepared for things to really hit the fan in the next few years. I think it wasn't too long ago, maybe it was the Thucydides Trap episode, where I talked about a prophecy I heard when I was a kid about the next great war. And I remember hearing this when I was like, it must have been in the late 90s. So I was like 10, 12 years old. But I remember hearing this guy make a prophetic prediction on the Coast to Coast radio show. And he said, around the time 2030, the United States and China would go to war. And it would be a war unlike one the world had ever known. And it would basically just destroy the planet. And that never left my mind for some reason. I talked about this not too long ago, a few months ago in an episode, if you want to go back and listen. But that's always been in my mind because he was just making this projection like 30 years out at a time when people were talking about Y2K or maybe like the Mayan calendar in 2012. This guy's saying, now forget all that. Like, look at 2030. And this was when China was not anything like what China is becoming today. So it makes it even more credible in my opinion. But I'm just going to echo that back to you because we're a decade away now. And if we are truly on the verge of a depression and we're following that history echoing the past pattern, well, then that would say that 2030 would put us right around that equivalent of what World War II was to the Great Depression. So keep that in mind as well as you prepare over the coming years. If you live in an urban area, it might be a good time to start considering a way to live in a rural area. Buck the trend and get out of the urban population centers. There's just so much danger in that. Maybe it's just the Jeffersonian agrarian in me, but I've never been fond of the idea of living in a city. I lived in Philadelphia for 7 years, and it destroyed a part of my soul. I mean, a part that I don't know if I'll ever get back. Don't get me wrong, I love Philadelphia. It's a great town in a lot of ways, but I was never meant to live in a city, and I really don't think anybody is, to be honest with you. Cities breed disease. They breed avarice, pride, arrogance, isolation, a lack of altruism for your fellow man, all sorts of negative things. If you can find a way to preserve your livelihood and also live in the country, if you don't already, I highly recommend doing it. And again, I'm saying this even keeled because I don't want to sound like a crazy conspiracy theorist or hyperbolic person, but there's just so much benefit in it. And if I'm wrong, you get to enjoy nature. What's the worst that could happen? But if I'm right, I mean, you might just save your family. Because I really think that a day is going to come where people who live in the cities will be trapped and they will become casualties of war like the world has not seen. And maybe casualties of pandemics as well. I mean, who's to say that we won't have another one worse than this at some point in our lifetime? Who's to say that something akin to the Spanish flu or the bubonic plague won't break out? If it does, you are much safer outside of the cities than you are in them. So just be careful. Look for ways to live closer to the earth on a smaller scale. If you can cancel anything that is just excess fat in your life right now, cancel it. Cancel those subscriptions that you don't need. Get rid of those bills that you don't need. This is a perfect opportunity to just lighten your load It's something I'm really trying to do right now, and I think that we would all be well served to do the same. Those of you who listen for any time know that my goal is to buy a large plot of land in a rural area. I'm probably going to end up being central Pennsylvania. I've been looking at North Carolina possibly as well because it's a whole lot cheaper. But my dream is to buy a large plot of land and make it an estate, a private village for those who want to come and share in that vision and kind of live that shared agrarian communal life. That's the long-term goal. I'm really trying to fast track that and accelerate it to make that happen in the next several years, because I don't know if we're going to have much more time beyond that. I really think things could truly, truly be taken to a next level, and this might be a harbinger for it. So just be prepared. Whatever your long-term plan is, I would start thinking of ways to try to accelerate it and see how you can get it into motion. America may not look the same on the other side of this. Europe may not look the same on the other side of this. Open borders, I think, are going to be a thing of the past. Sooner rather than later, I think retail shopping is probably going to be a thing of the past. I think people will be encouraged and perhaps even penalized if they don't obey with policies of isolation. I think working from home will become more and more the norm. Less people working in an office space setting. So you're going to have lighter workforces as well. Companies are going to find ways to trim the fat, work with less people in a more fluid and remote type of capacity. That way, if something like this happens again, they don't have to make a drastic shift on the fly. Companies learn their lesson, just like the banks learned their lesson after the mortgage crisis, subprime mortgage crisis. I think a lot of retailers and a lot of just big corporations in general are going to learn from their mistakes of having large workforces in brick and mortar places. And I think they're going to cut back and emphasize working from home. So again, getting away from the norm we've known for a long time. The world is changing, and there are moments where it changes very, very rapidly. I mean, things can stay the same for decades, and then all of a sudden they change. And what's the old saying? Like there's years where nothing happens, and then there's days where years happen. I think that that's true to form, and I think we're in one of those years. 2020, when we look back on it, is going to be one of those years where we'll say, "Oh, that's the predicate for that. That's how we got here. This was the accelerator, the catalyst for the new world to come." Just like the world changed after 9/11. I think a lot of us are going to be saying that about 2020. When January kicked off and we blew Soleimani to hell and basically flirted with going to war with Iran, which is a proxy for Russia and China, I think we were flirting with the concept of global war there, but nobody's ready for it. And I said it at the time. Nobody wants that right now. I mean, as much as our media might like to portray it that way, Fox News might like to portray it that way sometimes, none of these regimes are suicidal. Even North Korea, none of them have a death wish. But all of them are preparing for what is coming. I mean, I'm not some sage or brilliant thinker. If I'm recognizing the trajectory that we're on, people far smarter than me are light years ahead in terms of preparing for it. And I think that they're all stocking up for this reason, because they know there's a big change in the horizon. I mean, hell, China and Russia have been stacking bricks of gold for, the last 2 decades. So at some point, you got to think that they're planning for the U.S. dollar to tank. And, if we go to war with those countries, that would absolutely happen. They're also building their military arsenals. China's quickly becoming the most powerful economy in the world, but they're also trying to become one of the most powerful militaries in the world, becoming a naval force now in the South China Sea. Russia has the largest nuclear arsenal on the planet. The U.S. is second. So don't think that these countries don't see what's coming, because they do. And I'm sure the United States does. I'm sure Britain does as well. The EU as well. I think that we are going to quickly accelerate as that pinnacle, that apex gets closer. We're going to start accelerating and things are going to start happening faster. The question from my perspective right now is, how much liberty will we have left when we get to that point? Will America even be recognizable? Will it still be something worth fighting and dying for? Jefferson said the tree of liberty needs to be sprinkled with the blood of tyrants and martyrs every now and then because it is its natural manure. It sounded radical at the time, and maybe he backtracked on that after he saw the outcome of the bloody French Revolution, but nevertheless, I think it's true. And there has to come a point where if you want to preserve your liberty, if you want to preserve your independence, you have to be willing to fight for it. And I haven't seen a whole lot of fight or any resistance for that matter at all in this country, apart from a few, extremist right-wing militias, ones that ideologically I just am not on the same page with. Apart from those guys, I haven't seen much resistance at all. So you got to give them credit, I guess, for at least being willing to stand up for their beliefs. But most of us are just checked out, vegetated behind social media, sitting on our comfortable couch with the air conditioner and the heat, watching Netflix 12 hours a day. We're just checked out. And that is a recipe for disaster. If you do not have an educated and an engaged electorate, citizenry, how can you hope to have liberty? You don't even deserve it at that point. And I think we're flirting with that. We've been flirting with it for a while, and this might just be the nudge that pushes us over the edge. So be ready, because I think depression is a possibility. And if depression comes, and even if it doesn't come, I think war is a very, very present danger in the coming years. I'd say 10 to 12 years tops. That sounds like a while, but 10 years ago, 2010, year I graduated college. That doesn't, to me, that's like a blink of an eye. So brace yourself. Don't be caught unaware, off guard. Be alert, be vigilant. If you're not prepared, get prepared. It's a famous story. Most of you listening to this show probably are well aware of it, but I'll tell it anyway. During the Constitutional Convention, when the delegates from the 13 colonies were, trying to establish what type of government the United States would have, this young, virgin nation, just through blood and toil, obtained its independence from Great Britain. They were bickering and quarreling in a hot Philadelphia room, ironing out the details of what would become the United States Constitution. And for days they went back and forth, and nobody was really certain. You got to think, at that point, the world had really, functioned under monarchies for the most part. And, a lot of people thought we would go that route, and George Washington would become the first American monarch. And it very easily could have happened, but that's not what happened. Those men, I think we have a tendency to idolize them, but they were just men. Those men got in a room and they pounded out what would become what I believe to be one of the greatest documents in history, the United States Constitution. And as they laid out what would become our Bill of Rights and the Constitution of the United States of America, people watched and they wondered, what is this going to look like? What is this new experiment going to be, and how will it end? And there's this story of an 81-year-old Benjamin Franklin coming out right after the delegates had established the government and decided what type of government the United States would operate under. A group of citizens walk up to Mr. Franklin as he's coming out of the Constitutional Convention, and they say, "Mr. Franklin, what type of government do we have, sir?" And he's reported to look at them and say, "A republic, if you can keep it." A republic, if you can keep it.